The morning light was barely a whisper over the horizon when Dawn Taylor stepped onto the cracked sidewalk. Her worn shoes hitting the pavement with a determined, weary rhythm. She glanced up briefly, catching a glimpse of the pastel-colored dawn. But there was no time to admire it. She had a schedule, one crafted out of necessity, stretching her endurance to its limit. But it was the only way she could keep herself and her daughter afloat. Today was like every other day. 5 jobs lay ahead of her: scrubbing office floors, serving tables at the bustling diner, watching over the neighbor's baby, cleaning the late-night convenience store, and finally, delivering newspapers before the city awoke. Each job was another puzzle piece in her exhausting quest to survive. And though her bones ached and her eyes burned with fatigue, she kept moving. She had no choice. Her thoughts drifted to Tasha, her 9-year-old daughter, still curled up in the one bed they shared in their tiny apartment. Just last night, she had whispered her usual promises to Tasha as they lay side by side, the child's soft breathing eventually lulling Dawn into a short but restless sleep. "One day, baby, I'll get us out of here. You'll have your own room, your own bed, and you won't have to worry about anything." Those words were a balm to Tasha, and Dawn clung to them as tightly as her daughter did, even if they felt like dreams slipping further out of reach with each passing day. Her first job took her to a sleek office building downtown. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she bent to scrub the floors, her hands moving automatically, her mind wandering to bills that were piling up on her kitchen counter like a taunt. The rent was overdue, the electric bill teetered on the edge of disconnection, and the fridge was growing emptier by the day. She felt the weight of each burden pressing down on her shoulders, almost crushing her under their constant, unyielding presence. As she wiped down the hallway, 2 businessmen passed by without sparing her a glance, their conversations floating over her head. They were talking about stock prices, weekend trips, a life she could barely fathom. In moments like these, Dawn felt invisible, as if her labor went unseen, her struggles unnoticed, a mere background fixture in a world that moved without her. But Dawn Taylor was not invisible, not to herself, and certainly not to Tasha. Each step, each breath, each aching muscle was a testament to her resolve. This was survival, and she had mastered it, no matter how harsh, how unkind. And though she felt drained and weary, there was a quiet fire within her that refused to be extinguished. As she finished her shift and gathered her things, Dawn cast one last glance at the shiny office lobby. One day, she told herself, one day, things would change. With that silent promise, she pulled her coat tight around her shoulders, braced against the cold, and stepped back onto the city streets, ready to face the next battle in her endless day. It was late in the evening, and the quiet hum of the police station felt strangely calming as Dawn scrubbed the cold tiles, her hands moving in small circles over scuffed floors. She was nearly finished with her shift. The second of 5 she would push through before dawn broke again. Her arms ached, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed loudly in the empty corridors. But she kept working, her mind drifting to Tasha, who was likely asleep at home under a pile of blankets. As she cleaned, the officers moved around her in waves, coming and going, barely noticing her presence. She was invisible to most of them, another anonymous figure moving through their halls, a ghost, vanishing as soon as she finished her tasks. But one officer, a tall, sharp-eyed man, paused in the hallway, glancing in her direction. Officer Reed had seen her around the station often, her quiet, steady presence a contrast to the bustling energy of the other officers. Tonight, as he walked past, he felt something tug at his attention, pulling him toward her, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the way she moved, each motion deliberate, focused, or maybe it was the faint, exhausted slump in her shoulders, a silent testimony to her endless struggle. He watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Dawn, right?" His voice was calm, his tone gentle but firm. Startled, Dawn looked up, a wary expression crossing her face as her hand stilled on the mop. She wasn't used to the officers noticing her, much less addressing her by name. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice cautious. Years of experience had taught her that attention, especially from authority figures, was rarely a good thing. She braced herself, wondering if she had done something wrong. But instead of reprimanding her, Reed smiled faintly. "I see you here almost every night. You work hard." She nodded, unsure where this was going. "Yes, sir, I have to." She hesitated, but there was something in Reed's eyes, something genuine, kind, that made her add quietly, "It's for my daughter, Tasha." Reed's expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing over his face. He didn't have children of his own, but he'd seen enough struggle in his line of work to know how fierce a parent's love could be. 5 jobs. Ha? He asked, his voice soft but laced with respect. That can't be easy. Dawn let out a small, hollow laugh. No, sir. It's not easy. She shifted her weight, feeling exposed under his gaze. Talking about her hardships wasn't something she did often, especially with strangers. But something in his gentle curiosity made her feel safe. Just for a moment, as if her struggle was seen and understood. Reed nodded, his brows knitting together as he took in her words. You know, takes a lot of strength to keep going like that. He said quietly, not everyone could do what you do. Dawn looked away, her heart tightening. Strength. It was a word she didn't often associate with herself. Survival. Maybe. Endurance. Perhaps. But strength? She wasn't so sure. To her, strength was something fierce. Unbreakable. She was tired, worn, and struggling. Still, something about his words felt like a balm on an old wound. A reminder that maybe, just maybe, she was more than her exhaustion. Thank you, she murmured, unsure of what else to say. Officer Reed simply nodded. Hang in there, he said, his voice a low promise. You're stronger than you know. Dawn. He left her there, his words lingering in the quiet, empty hall like a small flame, warm and unexpected. And as Dawn returned to her work, her hands moving over the floors with new focus, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A faint flicker of hope, a fragile spark that whispered, just maybe, she could make it through. The night air was cold, thick with the quiet of an empty street as Dawn hurried home after her final shift. The city around her was silent. The only sounds the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional drip of water from a nearby gutter. Her body was exhausted, her thoughts drifting to Tasha, who was no doubt fast asleep by now. She clutched her bag tighter, her steps quick and purposeful, eager to reach the safety of her small apartment. But as she turned a corner, a chill crept over her, an instinctive awareness that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She glanced back, her heart pounding as she caught a glimpse of a shadow trailing her at a distance. She quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing in the empty street. But the shadow only followed, matching her speed. Keep calm, she told herself, clutching her bag to her chest. But her pulse was racing. Her mind darted through escape plans, rehearsing the routes she'd memorized from years of walking these streets. She cast another quick look behind her, and that's when she saw him, a man stepping out of the shadows, his eyes dark and fixed on her. Before she could react, he lunged forward, gripping her arm with iron strength. Panic seized her as she stumbled back, his fingers digging into her skin like claws. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat, the terror so thick it choked her. Her hands flew up, pushing against him with all the force she could muster. But he was stronger, unyielding. Let go, she cried, her voice a raw plea. She twisted and turned, trying to pull herself free. But it was no use. Her mind raced, fear clouding her thoughts. But she refused to give in. She fought with everything she had, digging her nails into his arm, kicking, thrashing, desperate to break his grip. Just when she felt her strength slipping, a blinding flash of red and blue lights cut through the darkness, accompanied by the shrill wail of sirens. Relief surged through her as police cars skidded to a stop nearby, their doors flinging open. Officers rushed toward them, shouting commands as her attacker released her and attempted to flee. Dawn stumbled back, her knees weak, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She felt a pair of steady hands grip her shoulders, and she looked up into the familiar face of Officer Reed, his eyes wide with worry. Are you all right? He asked, his voice steady, but his gaze sharp, scanning her for injuries. Dawn could barely nod, her throat too tight to speak. She clutched his arm, grounding herself in his presence, the reality of what had just happened crashing down on her in waves. Let's get you somewhere safe, he said gently, guiding her toward the car, his hand never leaving her shoulder. She sank into the seat, her hands shaking, her mind reeling from the attack. In that moment, the city lights outside seemed to fade, leaving her cocooned in the warmth of the car. Reed's presence a quiet assurance that she wasn't alone. As they drove, Reed glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression softening. You're safe now, Dawn. I promise you, we'll keep you safe. Dawn leaned her head back, closing her eyes, the weight of exhaustion settling over her. She had come so close to losing everything in that dark alley, but she was still here, still fighting, and with Reed by her side. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, her world could change. Dawn couldn't shake the feeling of fear as she returned to the police station the next day, her mind still replaying the night before, the cold grip of her attacker's hands, the looming shadows, but there was another feeling creeping into her heart. Something warmer and unfamiliar, gratitude. Officer Reed had saved her, and she knew that. Without him, she might not be alive today. As she entered the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the faint hum of conversation filled the air. Officers glanced her way, some nodding in recognition, and she felt a sudden self-consciousness, her fingers twitching with nervous energy. She wasn't sure why she'd been called here. All she'd been told was to come down to the station after her shift. "Dawn Taylor," a voice called from behind the desk. She turned and saw Officer Reed standing there, his face breaking into a gentle smile when their eyes met. His presence felt like a lifeline, a beacon of calm in her otherwise stormy world. "Officer Reed." She greeted him, her voice barely a whisper. "Come with me," he said, gesturing down a hallway. She followed him, her heart thumping as they walked through the station, passing rows of desks cluttered with case files, half-empty coffee cups, and the steady clack of keyboards. She felt out of place, as if she were stepping into a world she didn't belong to. Reed led her to a small room, where several officers were waiting, along with a woman she didn't recognize, dressed in a crisp suit and carrying a stack of papers. Dawn's stomach knotted as she looked around, feeling the weight of so many eyes on her. "Dawn, please take a seat," the woman said, her voice kind but professional. Dawn sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Reed took a seat beside her, offering a reassuring nod. The woman smiled warmly. "Dawn, my name is Captain Harris. Officer Reed told us about what happened to you last night, and we wanted to let you know that we're here to support you. We've all been inspired by your strength and your determination to provide for your daughter." Dawn swallowed, unsure where this was leading. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely steady. Captain Harris exchanged a glance with Reed before continuing. "We know you've been working incredibly hard, juggling 5 jobs to make ends meet. It's a lot for anyone to bear, especially on your own." Dawn's eyes dropped to the table, embarrassment warming her cheeks. She hadn't expected anyone here to understand, let alone care about her struggles. She had always believed her burdens were her own to carry. Private battle she fought in silence. "We want to help," Captain Harris said, her voice gentle but steady. "We've arranged a scholarship for you at the local community college. It's enough to cover tuition and books. And we've also pulled together some funds to help with your rent for the next 6 months." Dawn's mouth fell open, her mind struggling to process the words. Scholarship? Rent? She felt as if she were dreaming, as if at any moment, she'd wake up in her small apartment, back to the grinding reality of her life. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice breaking. Reed leaned forward, his gaze warm and steady. "You don't have to say anything, Dawn. Just promise us one thing. Don't give up on yourself. You're stronger than you think, and we want to see you succeed." A lump rose in her throat, and tears pricked her eyes. She had grown so used to surviving on her own, to bearing the weight of her hardships in silence, that this unexpected kindness felt like a miracle. She looked around at the faces of the officers, Captain Harris, and finally at Reed, who smiled gently, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "We believe in you, Dawn," Reed added softly. "You're not alone anymore." Dawn took a shaky breath, clutching the papers they handed her, her hands trembling. She didn't know how to express the gratitude that swelled within her, didn't have the words to capture the hope that was now blossoming, fragile but undeniable. As she left the station that day, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She held the folder to her chest, each step a little steadier, each breath a little freer. For the first time in a long time, Dawn felt that her life might be more than just an endless cycle of struggle. She had a chance, a real chance, to build something better for herself and for Tasha. And as she walked back to her small apartment, Dawn whispered a new promise to herself, her voice full of quiet resolve. This is only the beginning. The classroom was buzzing with a quiet hum as students shuffled into their seats, the clatter of books and the scrape of chairs filling the air. Dawn took a deep breath, clutching her notebook as she stepped through the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt completely out of place, as if she'd wandered into someone else's life by mistake. She hadn't been inside a classroom in over a decade, and now, sitting among students much younger than her, she felt like she was on unfamiliar ground. Her gaze drifted to the front of the room where the professor was arranging his notes, oblivious to the nervous energy that radiated from her. All around her, students chatted with each other, their faces bright with excitement and familiarity. Dawn felt a pang of self-consciousness as she glanced down at her own hands, calloused and worn from years of work. The scholarship and support from the officers had made it possible for her to be here, but she still couldn't shake the fear that she didn't belong. Taking a seat near the back, She pulled out her notebook, her hands trembling slightly. The thought of learning, of growing, was thrilling but terrifying too. She was here to study social work, to learn how to help people like herself, people who felt invisible and trapped in cycles of hardship. But as the professor began to speak, introducing concepts she hadn't heard before, Dawn's nerves returned, making her doubt her choice. "Welcome to Introduction to Social Work." The professor's voice boomed, pulling her out of her thoughts. "This class is about making a difference, about understanding the unique challenges that individuals and families face. It's about helping others find hope where there seems to be none." The words resonated with her, striking a chord deep within. She thought about Tasha, the little girl who looked to her for strength and comfort. Tasha was the reason she was here, the reason she had dared to dream of a better life. Dawn couldn't fail her now. The professor continued, describing stories of resilience and transformation, of people who had fought their way through adversity to find new paths. Dawn's heart swelled, her fears slowly fading as she realized she was exactly where she needed to be. These stories were her story too. She wasn't just here to learn. She was here to make a difference. After the class, she gathered her books and started to leave when a young student approached her. He looked curious, maybe a little surprised to see her there. "Excuse me," he said, smiling kindly. "Are you new here? I don't think I've seen you around before." Dawn hesitated, feeling the urge to explain herself, to justify her presence in this space. But instead, she returned his smile and nodded. "Yes, I am. It's been a while since I've been in school, so I'm still getting used to it." The student's face softened with admiration. "That's awesome. Takes a lot of courage to come back to school. I bet you're going to do great." His words settled into her heart, a small but powerful reminder that she belonged here. She wasn't just a tired single mother fighting to make ends meet. She was someone who had faced the darkest moments of her life and still dared to dream of something better. Leaving the classroom, Dawn felt a renewed sense of purpose, the weight of self-doubt lifting with every step. She wasn't just here for herself. She was here for Tasha, for the chance to build a future that was bright, stable, and filled with possibilities. As she made her way home, she imagined telling Tasha about her day, about the brave new world of learning she was entering. She could already picture the pride in her daughter's eyes, and that thought alone made every challenge worthwhile. Dawn knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be late nights, endless studying, and moments where she would question if she was good enough. But for Tasha, for the future she was determined to build, she was willing to give it everything she had. And as she walked back into the bustling world she had known for so long, Dawn held her head a little higher, her steps a little lighter, her spirit fueled by a newfound sense of belonging. She had taken the first step on a path she had never thought possible. And for the first time, she believed she was ready for whatever came next. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the city as Dawn made her way home, her mind buzzing with everything she had learned in class. She felt a sense of pride she hadn't known in years, a feeling that she was building something, that her dreams for Tasha were finally starting to take shape. But as she approached her apartment, a familiar figure caught her eye, leaning casually against the brick wall near the entrance. Her heart stopped. Marcus. He hadn't changed much since the last time she saw him, though he looked rougher around the edges. His face lined with weariness and a dangerous glint in his eye. Marcus, her ex, the man who had once been her world and then her worst mistake, was standing in front of her like a ghost come to life. Dawn's stomach twisted as memories flooded back, of promises he'd broken, the trouble he'd brought into their lives, and the fear she had worked so hard to leave behind. She steadied herself, her grip on her bag tightening as she approached him, hoping her fear didn't show. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "What are you doing here?" He looked her up and down, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Heard you've been doing well for yourself," he drawled, crossing his arms. "Got yourself a little scholarship, some help from the cops. You must be feeling pretty good." "Huh." Dawn felt a surge of anger at his words, his mocking tone chipping away at her composure. She forced herself to stay calm, though her heart was pounding. "We're not your concern anymore, Marcus. Tasha and I are doing fine without you." Marcus's smirk faded, replaced by a hardness in his gaze. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You think you can just cut me out? Forget about me? I'm still her father. Dawn, you don't get to act like I don't exist." Her pulse quickened, but she stood her ground, meeting his gaze with defiance. "You're not her father," she replied quietly, her voice filled with conviction. "You lost that right a long time ago." For a moment, they stood in tense silence, the weight of their past pressing down on them. Dawn could feel the danger simmering beneath Marcus's calm exterior, a threat she hadn't felt in years. She wanted nothing more than to turn and run, to protect Tasha from the darkness he represented. But she couldn't let him see her fear. Not now. Listen, he said, his voice dropping lower, a hint of desperation slipping through. I know I messed up, but I need a fresh start too. And maybe you owe me that much. Dawn's anger flared, her hands balling into fists. I don't owe you anything, Marcus. I worked hard to get where I am, and I'm not letting you take that away from me or from Tasha. He scoffed, his face hardening again. You think you're better than me now? Just because you got some help? Don't forget where you came from. Dawn. The words stung, but she refused to let them affect her. I know exactly where I came from. That's why I'm never going back. A shadow passed over Marcus's face, and he took another step forward, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. You might want to rethink that. Dawn, you've got money now, and I've got debts. If you won't help me out of goodwill, maybe I'll just have to make you. Fear shot through her, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. Leave, Marcus. If you ever come near me or Tasha again, I'll call the police. His eyes narrowed, anger flaring as he straightened. For a moment, Dawn thought he might try to force his way past her, but he merely clenched his jaw, spitting out his words. This isn't over, Dawn. With that, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the gathering shadows, leaving her standing there, heart racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She watched him go, the weight of his words pressing down on her, filling her with a mixture of dread and determination. She couldn't let him back into her life, not after everything she had fought so hard to build. With shaky hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed Officer Reed's number. She had avoided asking for help, hesitant to burden anyone else with her problems. But she knew she couldn't face this alone. Dawn. Reed's voice was calm, steady, like an anchor. Is everything all right? No, she whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus is back. He showed up outside my apartment. Pause. She could almost feel Reed's concern through the phone. I'm coming over right now. Stay inside. Lock the doors. And don't open them for anyone. Don't know that. Clutching the phone as if it were a lifeline. Thank you, Officer Reed. Call me Ethan, he replied gently, his voice softening. And don't worry, Dawn. I won't let him hurt you or Tasha. Not ever. As she hung up, calm settled over her, the first she had felt since Marcus's sudden appearance. Reed, or Ethan, as she reminded herself, would be there soon. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her past wouldn't define her future. That night, as she locked her door and sat by Tasha's bedside, watching her daughter's peaceful sleep, Dawn made a promise to herself. She would protect Tasha, no matter what. She would build a life free from fear, free from the shadows that had haunted them for so long. And as she waited for Ethan's knock at the door, Dawn knew she was ready to face whatever came next. The days blurred into weeks, and for the first time in her life, Dawn began to feel something unfamiliar. Stability. The weight of fear that had once followed her every step was slowly fading, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. She was taking college classes, working fewer hours, and spending more time with Tasha, who seemed to blossom with every passing day. Dawn had never known life to be anything but a struggle. But now, with the help of the scholarship and support from the officers, she was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, life didn't have to be that way. Every night she would sit at the kitchen table, textbooks open, reading and taking notes until her eyes blurred. And when she felt her energy wane, Tasha would slip into the kitchen, wrap her little arms around her mother's shoulders, and whisper, "You can do it, Mom." Those words, simple but powerful, kept her going. One evening, after a particularly long study session, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Officer Reed, Ethan, as she now thought of him, standing there, holding a small bag of takeout and a warm smile on his face. "Thought you might need a break," he said, handing her the bag. Dawn laughed, a sound that felt foreign yet delightful. "You read my mind. I was just about to make some instant noodles." "Well, I think you deserve better than that." He stepped inside, glancing around at the modest apartment she had worked so hard to make feel like home. Tasha was in her room, reading a book, and the quiet hum of their little world felt safe, something Dawn didn't take for granted. As they sat down to eat, Ethan studied her, his gaze warm but thoughtful. "How's school going?" "It's hard," Dawn admitted, picking at her food. "Sometimes I feel so out of place, like I'm too old to be there, like everyone else belongs. And I'm just..." She shrugged, struggling to find the words. "Like I'm an outsider." Ethan listened, nodding as he leaned forward. "You belong, Dawn. You've earned this chance. And don't let anyone make you feel like you haven't. You're doing something incredible, not just for yourself but for Tasha." Dawn looked down, her heart swelling with gratitude she couldn't quite put into words. Ethan had been there for her through so much. A steady presence in her life that she had come to trust and depend on. She felt a warmth in his words. A sense of belief in her that she hadn't dared to feel for herself. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "I don't know what I would have done without you." He shrugged, his smile soft. "You would have figured it out. You always do. I just happened to be lucky enough to be along for the ride." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the air between them felt charged, a quiet understanding passing between them. Dawn looked away, a faint smile on her lips, as she tried to hide the blush rising in her cheeks. After they finished eating, Ethan leaned back, watching Tasha as she played with her dolls in the living room. "You know," he said softly, "you're raising a remarkable little girl. She's smart, kind, and brave, just like her mother." Dawn's chest tightened at the words, emotions welling up that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Being a mother had always been her greatest joy, but it had also been her greatest fear. She had worried every day if she was doing enough, if she could protect Tasha from the hardships of the world. But hearing Ethan's words, she felt a spark of confidence, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, she was doing all right. "She deserves the world," Dawn said, her voice thick with emotion. "I just want her to have a life I could never give her. And you're giving her that life, Dawn," Ethan replied firmly. "Don't doubt yourself. You're doing it." As the evening wore on, they talked about everything and nothing, about her classes, about Tasha's dreams of becoming a scientist, about the little moments that had begun to make up this new, hopeful life. Dawn found herself laughing, sharing stories, feeling lighter than she had in years. When Ethan finally rose to leave, Dawn walked him to the door, the warmth of the evening lingering around them. "Thank you for tonight," she said, a soft smile on her lips. "I needed this." Ethan returned her smile, his gaze lingering on her. "Anytime, Dawn. I mean that." And as he left, Dawn watched him go, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. She was no longer alone, no longer fighting this battle by herself. Ethan had become a friend, a confidant, maybe even something more. And for the first time in her life, she felt that she didn't have to bear the weight of the world alone. The next morning, as Dawn got Tasha ready for school, her daughter beamed up at her. "You look happy, Mom," Tasha said, her eyes wide with curiosity. Dawn laughed, reaching down to smooth Tasha's hair. "I am, sweetie. I think things are going to be okay." Tasha grinned, her innocence and trust filling Dawn's heart with strength. "I knew they would be. Mom, you're the best mom in the world." And as Dawn watched her daughter run off to join her friends, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't known before. She was building a new life, brick by brick, step by step. The shadows of her past were fading, replaced by the light of hope and possibility. She had never imagined she would reach this point. But now, with Ethan's friendship, Tasha's love, and her own unbreakable spirit, she felt that anything was possible. The world was opening up to her, and she was ready to embrace it. The cool night air was calm as Dawn sat by the window, watching Tasha sleep peacefully, her small form bundled under a quilt. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of city sounds drifting through the open window. But tonight, Dawn's heart was restless. Her mind kept drifting back to Marcus's sudden reappearance and the subtle threat he'd left hanging in the air. Just as her thoughts began to settle, her phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with Ethan's name, and a wave of relief washed over her. She picked up immediately. "Dawn, I need you to listen closely." Ethan's voice came through, calm but serious. "We've received some information. Marcus has been involved in more serious criminal activities than we realized. There are people looking for him, and that puts you and Tasha in danger." Dawn's heart skipped a beat, her grip tightening around the phone. "What do you mean? Is he involved with dangerous people?" "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice dropping to a grave tone. "We've discovered that Marcus was working with a group involved in organized crime, drug trafficking, extortion. You name it, they're looking for him, and we believe they might try to use you to get to him." A chill ran down her spine, a mix of dread and disbelief twisting in her stomach. Her past with Marcus had already brought so much hardship. Now it seemed the shadows of his choices were closing in once again. What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, her voice barely steady. "Tasha, I can't let her get caught up in this." Ethan's voice softened, but there was a steady strength behind it. "Dawn, we're going to keep you both safe. We've arranged for a safe house in a nearby town. It's temporary, but it'll keep you out of reach while we work to get this sorted." Dawn glanced back at Tasha, her innocent face still nestled against the pillow. Her heart ached at the thought of uprooting their lives again, but she knew she had no choice. Tasha's safety came before anything. "When do we leave?" she asked. her voice barely above a whisper. "First thing in the morning," Ethan replied. "I'll be there to pick you up. Pack light, just the essentials. We'll make sure you have everything you need once you're settled." She nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Thank you, Ethan. I don't know what we'd do without you. We'll get through this. Dawn, I won't let anything happen to either of you," he promised, his words steady and reassuring. After they hung up, Dawn moved quietly around the apartment, gathering a few essentials: a change of clothes, Tasha's favorite stuffed animal, a family photo they had taken in a park, a rare moment of peace captured forever. She tried to keep her movements silent, not wanting to disturb Tasha, but her mind was racing, thoughts flashing like lightning through her head. How had her life come to this? The fear she had worked so hard to leave behind had returned, even more intense than before. By dawn, she was ready, her bags packed and her heart steeling itself for whatever lay ahead. When she opened the door, she found Ethan waiting, his face calm but his eyes holding a protective fierceness. "Are you both ready?" he asked, glancing at Tasha, who clung to her mother's side, wide-eyed and confused.
Don't know that.
Squeezing Tasha's hand. "We're ready." As they drove, Ethan explained the details of the safe house. It was in a quiet, secluded neighborhood far from the city, monitored by officers to ensure their protection. He assured her that this was only temporary, a necessary precaution until they could guarantee her safety. The house was small, tucked away on a quiet street lined with trees. Inside, it was sparsely furnished but comfortable. A living room with a cozy couch, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. As they stepped inside, Dawn felt a sense of bittersweet relief wash over her. It wasn't home, but it was a sanctuary, a place where she could breathe, if only for a moment. Tasha looked around, her eyes wide with curiosity and worry. "Mom, why are we staying here? Did something happen?" Dawn knelt down, pulling Tasha into a comforting hug. "It's just for a little while. Sweetheart, we need to stay somewhere safe. And this is a safe place. Everything is going to be okay. I promise." Tasha nodded, trusting her mother's words. Though Dawn could feel the uncertainty in her small frame, she held her daughter close, vowing silently that she would do whatever it took to protect her. The days at the safe house passed slowly, each one marked by quiet routines and the underlying tension of waiting. Dawn and Tasha adjusted as best they could, finding ways to fill the empty hours. Dawn would read her textbooks in the morning, while Tasha played with her dolls or worked on school assignments Ethan had brought over for her. Ethan visited regularly, checking in and updating her on the investigation. His presence was a source of calm in the midst of her storm, his steady support a reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. Each visit brought with it a sense of peace, as if his very presence could ward off the darkness closing in around them. One evening, as Tasha slept, Ethan and Dawn sat on the small back porch, the night air crisp and filled with the scent of pine. Dawn looked out into the darkness, her thoughts heavy with worry. "Do you think it'll ever end?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The fear? The running?" Ethan looked at her, his gaze filled with empathy and conviction. "Yes, Dawn, it will end. We'll make sure of it. You've been through so much, but you're not alone anymore. We're going to see this through, and you and Tasha will have a future free from all of this." His words settled over her like a blanket, warming the cold fear in her heart. She felt herself leaning into that reassurance, allowing herself to believe that perhaps, for once, everything might truly be all right. But just as things seemed to be settling, the peace was shattered. Late one night, Dawn was jolted awake by a loud crash echoing through the house. She sat up, heart pounding, as Tasha stirred beside her, eyes wide with fear. "Mom, what was that?" Tasha whispered, clutching her mother's hand. "Stay close to me, baby," Dawn replied, her voice barely steady. She grabbed her phone, dialing Ethan's number with trembling hands. "Dawn." Ethan's voice came through, groggy but instantly alert as he picked up. "What's wrong?" "Someone's here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Someone's trying to get in. Lock yourselves in the bathroom. I'm on my way," he instructed, his voice sharp with urgency. Dawn clutched Tasha's hand, leading her into the small bathroom and locking the door behind them. She wrapped her arms around her daughter, her heart pounding as the sounds of footsteps echoed through the house. Tasha buried her face in her mother's shoulder, trembling. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of sirens cut through the night, followed by a commotion as officers swarmed the house. The intruders were subdued, taken into custody as Ethan and the other officers stormed inside. Ethan found Dawn and Tasha huddled in the bathroom, his face filled with relief as he knelt down, taking Dawn's hand. "It's over, Dawn. They're gone. You're safe." Dawn let out a shaky breath, the weight of her fear slowly lifting as she looked into his eyes. She knew that this was just one battle in a larger war, but with Ethan by her side, she felt a strength she hadn't known before. In that moment, she realized that she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for freedom, freedom from the shadows of her past. Freedom for Tasha to grow up safe and unafraid. And with Ethan beside her, she knew she could face whatever came next. Dawn awoke to a soft morning light filtering through the blinds in the safe house's modest bedroom. Tasha was still sleeping soundly beside her, her small body curled up in peaceful oblivion. Despite the calm, Dawn's mind was anything but at ease. The attack from the night before had rattled her to the core, and though she tried to reassure herself that they were safe, an undercurrent of dread lingered. A knock at the door snapped her from her thoughts. She moved carefully, not wanting to wake Tasha, and answered it to find Ethan standing there, his face set in that quiet, protective expression she'd come to rely on. "Good morning, Dawn," he said, offering her a gentle smile that momentarily eased her anxiety. "I wanted to check in, see how you both are doing." "We're all right," she replied, though her voice wavered. "I keep telling myself we're safe here, but it's hard not to feel like this is just the calm before another storm." Ethan's gaze softened. "I understand, Dawn, and I promise we're doing everything we can to make sure this is the last time you'll ever have to look over your shoulder. We're closing in on the people who attacked you. We're almost there." Dawn took a deep breath. Nodding, she trusted Ethan, and his words brought her a fragile sense of hope. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "We'll get through this, together." As the day went on, Dawn did her best to maintain a routine for Tasha, filling their hours with reading, drawing, and whatever small activities could distract them from the invisible threat looming outside. Yet, in every quiet moment, she found herself looking out the window, half expecting another shadow to emerge from the trees. Late that afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the horizon, Dawn's phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. "Just a heads up. I'm stopping by in a bit to discuss a few updates. Hang tight," she replied quickly, her heart easing at the thought of seeing him. Ethan had been her anchor through all of this, a calm in the storm that seemed endless. About 20 minutes later, another knock came at the door. She smiled, assuming it was Ethan, and moved to open it. But when she looked through the peephole, her breath hitched. The man on the other side wasn't Ethan. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and unfamiliar, his dark clothes and hard gaze instantly setting her on edge. She backed away, instinctively reaching for Tasha, who was seated on the couch, playing quietly with her doll. "Tasha," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Come here, baby. We need to go into the bedroom." Tasha looked up, confusion flitting across her face. "Why, Mom? Just trust me," Dawn replied, her voice tight as she took her daughter's hand and hurried her toward the bedroom. Locking the door behind them, her heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through her veins as she dialed Ethan's number. He answered on the first ring. "Dawn, there's someone at the door," she whispered, barely able to control the tremor in her voice. "It's not you, and I don't know who it is." A tense silence followed before Ethan's voice returned, his tone deadly calm. "Lock all the doors and windows. Don't answer if they knock again. I'm on my way." Dawn did as he said, her hands shaking as she locked the bedroom window and barricaded the door with the small dresser. She clutched Tasha tightly, whispering words of comfort, though fear was thick in her throat. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Dawn pressed her ear against the door, listening for any sound that might indicate the man had left. But then, just when she thought she might be safe, the silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of a window breaking. Dawn's heart skipped a beat as footsteps echoed down the hall. Closer and closer, she held Tasha to her chest, trying to steady her own breathing as her daughter's small body trembled in her arms. She had promised to keep Tasha safe, and right now, that promise was all that mattered. The door handle rattled, and Dawn's breath caught. She heard the intruder muttering, his voice low and rough. "Come on out, Dawn. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." She pressed her hand over Tasha's mouth, a silent plea for her to stay quiet. The footsteps receded for a moment, but Dawn knew he hadn't left. He was circling, waiting for them to make a mistake. Just then, the faint sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder by the second. Relief flooded her, and she whispered to Tasha, "It's okay, sweetheart. Help is coming." The intruder must have heard the sirens too, because he cursed and turned back down the hall. Dawn listened as his footsteps retreated, the distant sound of him scrambling through the broken window and out into the night. Moments later, there was a knock on the bedroom door, and Dawn's heart leapt as she recognized Ethan's voice. "Dawn, it's me. You're safe now." She unlocked the door and threw it open, practically collapsing into his arms. He held her tightly, his hands gentle on her back, grounding her as her pulse gradually slowed. I thought he was going to hurt us," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe, Dawn. He's gone. Ethan murmured. His voice a steady bomb. But we're not taking any more chances. You and Tasha are coming with me. No more waiting. No more hiding here. Dawn nodded, unable to speak as she clung to him, her heart still racing. She held Tasha close, feeling the warmth of Ethan's presence surrounding them both. That night, Ethan drove them to a more secure location, a place he promised would be safe, far removed from the reach of those who were after Marcus. The new safe house was more isolated, nestled in a quiet rural area with no nearby neighbors, surrounded by trees that shielded it from prying eyes. When they arrived, Ethan walked them inside, his presence a reassuring constant as he helped Dawn settle Tasha in the smaller bedroom. The tension from the night's events still lingered, but Dawn could feel herself slowly beginning to relax in the comforting quiet of the new space. After Tasha had fallen asleep, Dawn and Ethan sat in the small kitchen, the dim light casting soft shadows around them. Ethan looked at her, his face etched with concern. This won't last forever. Dawn, I promise you, we're almost done with this. Once we've got enough evidence, we're going to bring down every last person involved. She met his gaze, the strength in his eyes grounding her. Thank you, Ethan. I don't think I would have made it this far without you. He took her hand, his touch warm and steady. You've been doing this on your own for too long. Dawn, you're not alone anymore. We're going to end this. And you and Tasha are going to have the life you deserve. A tear slipped down her cheek, and Ethan reached up, brushing it away with his thumb. His hand lingered, his gaze softening as he looked at her, a tenderness in his eyes that made her heart ache. You're stronger than you know, Dawn, he said, his voice a quiet murmur. You've been through hell and back, and you're still standing. You don't have to be afraid anymore. For the first time in years, Dawn felt hope blossoming in her chest, fragile yet fierce, like a light cutting through the darkness. She leaned into Ethan's warmth, allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. As they sat together in the quiet of the night, the weight of her past began to lift, replaced by the certainty that no matter what lay ahead, she wasn't facing it alone. Ethan would be by her side, and together, they would fight for the future she and Tasha deserved. The morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight filtering through the trees around the secluded safe house. For the first time in days, Dawn allowed herself a moment of peace, letting the quiet settle over her as she sipped her coffee. Tasha was still asleep in the small bedroom, and Ethan had left early to check in with his team, promising he'd return soon. But just as Dawn's heart began to settle, the soft sound of tires crunching on gravel outside made her freeze. She stood up, heart pounding, and peered out the window. A black car was pulling into the driveway, its windows tinted. Her pulse quickened with a mixture of fear and dread. As the car door opened, a familiar figure emerged, and the dread solidified into cold certainty. It was Marcus. Dawn took a shaky breath, her mind racing. How had he found her here? She quickly checked to make sure the door was locked, then took a step back, watching him approach with a casualness that made her stomach twist. This was a man she'd once trusted, a man who had shared her life and her dreams. Now, he was nothing more than a shadow from her past, a danger she couldn't afford to ignore. He knocked on the door, his voice muffled as he called out, "Dawn, open up. I know you're in there." Her hand shook as she held the phone, ready to call Ethan, but something stopped her. She had spent too long running, too long hiding. She wanted answers, and as terrified as she was, she knew this confrontation was inevitable. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and opened it just enough to see his face, her body tense and ready. "What do you want, Marcus?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Marcus's eyes flicked over her, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You're looking good, Dawn. Didn't expect you to have this place all to yourself. Looks cozy." She didn't respond to his attempt at charm. "Why are you here?" He sighed, his smirk fading as he leaned against the door frame. "I just wanted to talk, Dawn. I know things between us didn't end well, but I need your help." Dawn felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. "My help? After everything you've put us through? You really think I owe you anything?" His face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't come here to beg, Dawn, but you should know that there are people looking for me, dangerous people. They've put me in a corner, and I need a way out." She shook her head, disbelief mingling with anger. "You put yourself in that corner, Marcus. You dragged me and Tasha into this mess, and now you want me to help you escape it." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, almost pleading tone. "Dawn, they're not just after me. They know about you. They know about Tasha. They'll come for both of you if I don't find a way out." Fear spiked in her chest, but she kept her expression cold. "And whose fault is that, Marcus? You're the one who brought this on us. I won't put my daughter's life at risk for you." A flicker of frustration crossed his face, and he ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't have a choice, all right? I was trying to make things right for us, but it all spiraled out of control. Dawn felt her anger flare, years of hurt and betrayal boiling to the surface. You think this is some excuse, Marcus? Do you know how many nights I stayed awake, wondering if I'd ever be free of the mess you left behind? You made your choices. Now you get to live with them. For a moment, Marcus looked vulnerable, his bravado faltering. He glanced away, his jaw tight. I know I messed up, Dawn, but I never wanted this for you or Tasha. She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. You say that now, but where were you when we needed you? I'm done, Marcus. I won't let you drag us down with you anymore. A tense silence stretched between them, the weight of years of pain and regret hanging in the air. But as Dawn stood her ground, she saw something change in Marcus's eyes, a flicker of understanding, maybe even remorse. Fine, he said quietly, but I need you to promise me one thing. If anything happens, take care of Tasha. Keep her safe. Dawn's throat tightened, her anger tempered by a pang of empathy. Despite everything, she knew he cared about Tasha in his own flawed way. I don't need you to tell me that, Marcus. I'll protect her, no matter what. He nodded, his expression unreadable, before taking a step back. I never meant for it to end like this, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Before she could respond, a familiar voice broke the tension. Everything all right here? Dawn turned to see Ethan standing behind Marcus, his stance calm but his gaze sharp. Taking in the scene with careful attention, Marcus straightened, casting Ethan a wary glance. Just having a little chat with my ex, he said, his tone defensive. Ethan's eyes shifted to Dawn, his silent question clear. She nodded, grateful for his presence, the weight of the confrontation easing as he stepped forward. I think it's time for you to leave, Marcus, Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. Marcus's mouth tightened, his gaze lingering on Dawn one last time. Take care of yourself, Dawn, and watch your back. With that, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing down the drive, leaving a hollow ache in the pit of her stomach. Ethan closed the door, his gaze softening as he looked at her. Are you okay? Don't know that. Though her hands were still trembling. I'm fine. I needed to stand up to him. I couldn't let him keep holding this over us. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his steady presence grounding her. You did the right thing. You're stronger than you know, Dawn. The tension in her chest began to ease, replaced by a quiet, unfamiliar sense of pride. She had faced her past, confronted the fear that had haunted her for years, and for the first time, she felt free of its hold. Ethan's hand lingered on her shoulder, his gaze warm and full of something deeper, something that made her heart skip. You're not alone in this. I'm here for you. For both of you. She met his gaze, the weight of his words settling over her like a gentle embrace. She had spent so long feeling isolated, burdened by her past, but with Ethan by her side, the future seemed brighter, the possibilities within reach. That evening, as she held Tasha close, Dawn felt a profound sense of peace. She had taken control of her life, faced down the shadows, and emerged stronger. She knew there were challenges still ahead, but she was no longer the woman she had once been. With Ethan's support and Tasha's love, Dawn was ready to build the life she had dreamed of, a life free from fear, grounded in hope, and filled with the strength she had discovered within herself. And as the stars sparkled above the quiet safe house, Dawn allowed herself to believe that this was the beginning of something beautiful, something worth fighting for. Days passed in the quiet sanctuary of the safe house, each one a little brighter than the last. The confrontation with Marcus had left Dawn feeling lighter, as though she had shed a weight she'd been carrying for years. For the first time, she felt a sense of freedom from the shadows of her past. Tasha seemed to sense the change in her mother, too, her own smiles brighter and her laughter more frequent as they settled into this new rhythm of peace. Ethan had become a constant presence, visiting often, his calm support grounding them both. Dawn found herself looking forward to his visits, feeling a warmth she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She knew that, through everything, he had been there for her, not just as an officer but as a friend, and perhaps something more. But there was a part of her that still hesitated, fearful of trusting too deeply. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan arrived at the safe house carrying a stack of folders. His expression was determined as he spread the documents across the small kitchen table, his gaze flickering to Dawn with a spark of excitement. We're closing in on them, Dawn, he said, his voice brimming with a quiet intensity. The evidence we've gathered from Marcus and other sources has been enough to put together a case. We're planning a major operation to take down the whole syndicate. Dawn's breath caught, a mix of relief and apprehension settling over her. She looked down at the files, her mind racing. You mean, they'll finally be gone? No more threats. Ethan nodded. No more threats. This operation will be the end of it. You and Tasha will be free to live your lives without looking over your shoulders. A wave of emotion washed over her, and for a moment, she was speechless. All she could manage was a shaky, grateful smile. I can't believe it. After all these years, Ethan reached over, placing his hand over hers. You've earned this, Dawn. You've fought harder than anyone I know. This is your chance to finally move forward. She nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and gratitude. But as she looked at him, she saw the weight of the operation in his eyes, the danger he would be facing on her behalf. The realization hit her that his role in all of this went far beyond duty. He was risking his safety, too. Ethan, she began, her voice wavering. Thank you. For everything. I don't know if I could have made it without you. His gaze softened, his hand giving hers a gentle squeeze. I promised I'd be here, Dawn, and I meant it. In that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them, unspoken yet deeply felt. They had come to mean so much to each other, bound by shared hardships and a bond that had grown stronger with every battle. As he prepared to leave for the operation, Ethan looked at her one last time, his gaze lingering. I'll be back soon, and when I am, we're celebrating. She forced a smile, her heart tightening. I'll hold you to that. That night, as she lay beside Tasha, Dawn's thoughts were with Ethan, with the dangerous mission he was facing. She whispered a silent prayer, her hand resting protectively over her daughter's as she drifted into a fitful sleep. The next few days passed in tense anticipation. Each time the phone rang, her heart jumped, hoping it was Ethan with news. She kept herself busy, filling her hours with study and Tasha's schoolwork, but her mind was always somewhere else, lingering on thoughts of him. Finally, late one evening, there was a knock on the door. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, a faint smile on his face, a hint of exhaustion in his eyes. Relief flooded her, and she felt her composure slip as she pulled him into a tight embrace. You're safe, she whispered, her voice trembling. Thank God. Ethan held her, his arms wrapping around her protectively. It's over, Dawn. We got them all. They're not going to hurt anyone again. They stood there for a moment, wrapped in each other's warmth, the relief and emotion of the past few days settling over them. When they finally pulled apart, Dawn noticed a glimmer of something new in his gaze, something that went beyond friendship. Later that night, after Tasha had gone to bed, they sat together on the porch, the cool night air filled with the scent of pine. Dawn looked at Ethan, her heart full of gratitude and something more, a growing affection she could no longer ignore. You've been my rock through all of this, she said softly. I don't know how to thank you. Ethan reached for her hand, his fingers warm as they entwined with hers. Dawn, you don't owe me anything. All I want is for you to be happy, to have the life you deserve. Her gaze met his, her heart pounding. She saw the unspoken emotion in his eyes, the silent promise that he would be by her side, no matter what lay ahead. She felt her walls begin to crumble, the fear of opening her heart again slowly giving way to a fragile but undeniable hope. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't think I could have made it without you. You've shown me that I don't have to be alone. And I don't want to be. A gentle smile broke across his face as he pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. You're not alone, Dawn. You never will be. I'm here. In that quiet moment, under the starlit sky, Dawn felt a new sense of peace settle over her, a calm she hadn't known in years. She had found something she hadn't thought possible, a love that was steady, patient, and true. And as she rested in his embrace, she knew that this was the beginning of a life she had fought so hard to create. For the first time, Dawn allowed herself to believe in a future free from fear, a future filled with love and hope. She was no longer the woman defined by struggle. She was a survivor, a mother, and now, someone who could dream of happiness. As they sat together, Dawn felt that the road ahead would be different. The shadows of her past had finally been put to rest, replaced by the light of a new chapter. And with Ethan by her side, she knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. In the warmth of that embrace, beneath the vast expanse of stars, Dawn knew that she and Tasha were no longer just surviving. They were thriving, and the future was theirs to embrace. The next few weeks brought a peace Dawn had never known, a tranquility that settled over her life like a warm blanket. For the first time in years, she woke up without that familiar knot of dread in her stomach, and the shadows of her past no longer haunted her. Each day felt brighter, filled with the quiet routines of her and Tasha's new life. Ethan was now a steady presence in their world, his laughter and warmth filling the safe house in ways Dawn hadn't anticipated. His visits felt less like check-ins and more like coming home, his presence a source of comfort and joy. She often found herself looking forward to the evenings they shared, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, after a particularly long day of studying, Dawn decided to cook a special dinner. She had saved up and bought a few extra ingredients, determined to make something more celebratory than the usual. As she set the table, she felt a strange excitement bubbling within her, a feeling she hadn't let herself experience in a long time. Just as she was finishing up, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, a soft smile on his face and a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. "These are for you," he said, his eyes warm as he handed her the flowers. Dawn took them, her heart fluttering. "They're beautiful, Ethan. Thank you." As they sat down to dinner, Tasha's chatter filled the room, her laughter brightening the space as she told them stories from her day. Dawn watched Ethan as he listened intently, his attention fully on Tasha, laughing along with her and asking questions. He was so good with her daughter, so naturally protective and caring. Dawn couldn't help but feel her heart swell with a warmth she hadn't known in years. After dinner, when Tasha had fallen asleep, Dawn and Ethan moved to the small porch, the night air cool and filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars blink into view above them. Finally, Ethan turned to her, his gaze steady and filled with something she had come to recognize, a quiet, unwavering love. "You know, Dawn, these past few months, they've changed everything for me. You and Tasha, you've become a part of my life that I can't imagine letting go of." Dawn felt her breath catch, her heart pounding as his words sank in. She had spent so long keeping people at arm's length, protecting herself from the hurt that came with trust. But with Ethan, all those defenses felt unnecessary. He had been there through her darkest moments, his presence a constant, unbreakable support. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You've given me hope, and I never thought I could feel this way again." He reached for her hand, his fingers entwining with hers as he looked into her eyes. "You don't have to thank me, Dawn. I'm here because I want to be, because I care about you, and I want to be with you, in whatever way you're ready for." A tear slipped down her cheek, a mixture of joy and relief filling her heart. She had spent so many years feeling like she had to carry everything alone, like there was no room for love or happiness in her life. But now, in Ethan's steady gaze, she saw the possibility of a future she had once thought impossible. Slowly, she leaned forward, closing the space between them, and when their lips met, felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle, filled with all the unspoken promises they had shared, the love that had blossomed quietly but fiercely in the midst of her healing. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan held her close, his arms wrapped around her as if he would never let go. They sat together under the stars, wrapped in each other's warmth, letting the silence speak the words they couldn't quite find. Over the next few weeks, their bond deepened, the lines between their lives slowly disappearing. Ethan became a fixture in their world, helping Tasha with her homework, joining them for family dinners, and bringing a joy into their lives that Dawn hadn't realized she was missing. One Saturday morning, as they were having breakfast, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. Dawn's heart skipped a beat, her eyes widening as he took her hand, his gaze warm and full of love. "Dawn," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I never imagined finding someone like you, someone who could light up my world in ways I didn't even know I needed. You and Tasha, you're everything to me, and I want nothing more than to spend my life by your side." He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring, its delicate band glinting in the morning light. "Will you marry me, Dawn?" Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. She had spent so many years feeling alone, feeling as though happiness was something meant for other people. But here, in this moment, with Ethan's steady gaze and Tasha's hopeful smile, she knew that her life had changed in ways she could never have dreamed. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his own eyes bright with tears as he pulled her into his arms. Tasha jumped up, wrapping her arms around them both, her laughter filling the room as they held each other close. The months that followed were filled with a quiet joy as they prepared for their future together. Dawn completed her studies, her passion for social work growing stronger with each passing day. She knew that her experiences, the struggles, the hardships, and the resilience she had found, would guide her in helping others who were walking the same path she had once known. Their wedding was a simple ceremony held in the park, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and people from the community who had watched Dawn's journey. Tasha stood proudly as the flower girl, her joy as bright as the flowers she scattered along the aisle. As Dawn walked down the aisle, her heart swelled with gratitude, her gaze meeting Ethan's as he waited for her, his eyes filled with love and pride. In that moment, she felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by the knowledge that she was no longer just surviving. She was living, fully and freely. When they exchanged vows, Ethan took her hands, his voice a gentle promise. I will always be here, Dawn. Through every challenge, every joy, I will be by your side. Tears sparkled in her eyes as she replied, her voice steady. I have faced so much alone. But now, I know that together, there's nothing we can't overcome. I love you, Ethan. You're my safe place. My home. They sealed their promises with a kiss, and the world seemed to fade around them, leaving only the warmth of their love and the promise of a future built together. As the sun set over the park that evening, Dawn looked around at her new family, her husband, her daughter, her friends, all of whom had become a part of the life she had built from the ground up. She had fought her way through darkness and hardship, and now, as she looked toward the future, she felt a peace that filled every corner of her heart. She was no longer bound by fear, no longer defined by her struggles. She was Dawn Taylor, a woman who had found love, hope, and a future worth dreaming of. And as she held Tasha's hand and watched Ethan laugh with their friends, she knew that this was only the beginning of a beautiful journey. A journey she would never have to walk alone again. The days after the wedding felt like a dream. Dawn and Ethan settled into their new life together, their home filled with the laughter and warmth that had once felt like a distant fantasy. Every morning, Dawn woke up with a sense of gratitude, an awareness of the love and security that now surrounded her and Tasha. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that this happiness wasn't temporary. This was her new normal. But there was something else stirring within her, a quiet, growing desire to give back, to take her journey of struggle and resilience and turn it into something meaningful for others. One evening, as they sat on the porch after putting Tasha to bed, Dawn shared her thoughts with Ethan. I've been thinking a lot lately, she began, her voice soft, about everything I went through, about how many people out there are still living in that struggle. I want to help them. I want to be the kind of support I never had. Ethan looked at her with admiration, his hand reaching over to cover hers. I think that's a beautiful idea, Dawn, and you'd be amazing at it. You've already shown so much strength. I think it's time others get to see it, too. His words filled her with a new resolve. Dawn had spent so much of her life focused on survival. But now, with the strength she had found and the love that surrounded her, she knew she was ready to do more. She wanted to be a light for others, a voice of encouragement for those who felt unseen and unheard. The next day, she reached out to local organizations, exploring options for working with single mothers, survivors, and those fighting for a better life. She was welcomed with open arms, her story resonating with the leaders of community centers and outreach programs. They saw in her someone who didn't just talk about overcoming adversity, but who had lived through it and emerged stronger. Dawn found herself volunteering at a local shelter, running workshops on resilience, personal finance, and self-care. First, she was nervous, uncertain if her story could truly make a difference. But as she stood before a room of women with faces etched with exhaustion and determination, she saw herself in them. She recognized their struggles, their hopes, and, most importantly, their strength. Thank you for being here, she began, her voice carrying a warmth that came from her own journey. I know life isn't easy right now, but I want you to know that things can change. I was once where you are, wondering if I'd ever break free from the hardships, questioning if there was anything more than just getting by. The women listened, their eyes filled with a mixture of skepticism and hope. Dawn continued, sharing her story openly, telling them about the years she had juggled 5 jobs, the fear she had faced, and the moments she had almost given up. She spoke about her determination for Tasha, the love that had sustained her, and the people like Ethan who had given her the strength to keep going. As she spoke, she watched the women's expressions soften, their faces reflecting the flickers of hope that she remembered feeling once herself. By the end of the session, several women approached her, their voices quiet but full of gratitude. Your story gives me hope, one woman said, her eyes shining with tears. It's hard to believe things can get better, but seeing you, it makes me want to try. Dawn's heart swelled with pride and purpose. She had spent so long surviving, but now, she was part of something larger. She was helping others find the courage to dream again, to believe that they could build a life of their own. The weeks turned into months, and Dawn's role in the community grew. She developed close bonds with many of the women, helping them not only through workshops but also by being a constant source of encouragement, a listening ear, and a friend. She saw their progress firsthand, the small victories, the growing confidence, the moments they began to believe in themselves. One day, as she was leaving the shelter, she felt a small hand slip into hers. She looked down to see Tasha, who had come with Ethan to pick her up. Mom, I'm so proud of you, Tasha said, her eyes full of admiration. You're helping so many people. Dawn felt a tear slip down her cheek, moved by her daughter's words. Thank you, sweetheart. I want to make sure everyone has the chance to live a good life, just like we do now. Tasha nodded, a thoughtful look crossing her face. Do you think I could help someday, too? Dawn knelt down, pulling Tasha into a warm embrace. Of course you can, Tasha. You can do anything you set your mind to. You're already kind and brave. And that's what the world needs. As they walked home together, Dawn felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Her journey hadn't been easy, but now she understood that every struggle had led her to this purpose. She had found her voice, and through it, she was helping others find theirs. One evening, as she and Ethan sat together, he looked at her with a quiet pride. You're amazing, Dawn. You've taken everything you've been through and turned it into something beautiful, something that's changing lives. Dawn leaned into him, her heart full. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Ethan, you've been my strength. And now, I get to pass that strength on to others. Ethan kissed her forehead, his arms wrapping around her in a gentle embrace. You're my hero, Dawn. I've seen you transform, not just for yourself but for everyone around you. You're making the world a better place. As they sat together, watching the stars, Dawn felt an overwhelming sense of peace and gratitude. She had found not only love but purpose, a purpose that extended beyond herself, reaching into the lives of others and lifting them up. The road she had traveled was rough, marked by hardship and pain. But now, she was on a new path, a path of giving, of healing, and of hope. And with her family by her side, she knew there was nothing she couldn't face. Dawn's journey had taken her from survival to triumph, and as she looked toward the future, she knew that the best was yet to come. She was more than just a survivor. She was a force of change, a beacon of hope, and a reminder that no matter how dark the road, there was always a way forward. And as she watched Tasha play under the night sky, laughter ringing out into the quiet, Dawn knew that she had finally found her place in the world, a place filled with love, strength, and an unbreakable resolve to make a difference.